I usually will always start to jack up the sodium. And the morning of the show, if you're in a good spot, you should wake up the morning of the show and be dry as the desert, but you should definitely be a little bit flat.
Yeah.
And something I preach on, I tell everyone the last 10 hours before the show, the only thing that's going to be able to possibly fill you out or change your look drastically is sodium and water.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to Blood, Sweat, and Gear with coaches Skip Hill, Andrew Berry, myself, Scott McNally, and we are joined by Dom Mutascio, but you guys might know him as Dom Supersliced. What's going on, man?
Hey, Scott and Andrew, and Skip, thank you for having me on the show.
Dude, it is absolutely our pleasure. Before we get started, I want to say, guys, if you're new to our content, let me encourage you to subscribe and hit the bell. We have several shows that come out each week. We'd love to have you along for everything. And you know what? Leave us comments for the next episode. Most of our stuff, we do a lot of Q&A. We'd love to have you guys take part. And also, we are brought to you by TrueNutrition.com. Use our code THINK over there for additional savings on high-quality third-party tested supplements, including the Team Skip Blend. SupplementSource.ca for Canadians. They have great deals that change week to week. And thank you to everybody from Patreon. So, guys, I wanted to bring Dom on. I've been hearing about him from my wife, Victoria. You guys talk a lot about business stuff.
That's weird. My wife talks about him, too.
I wanted to find – we didn't get a chance to connect in Vegas, so I'm excited to finally get you on the show. I know that you're a fantastic coach with a ton of experience. Our listeners, I am sure, are going to be extremely grateful to hear everything you have to say. And on top of that, I know that you've been longtime friends with Andrew because you guys are from out back east. So, Andrew, I figured I'd let you take the wheel to kind of introduce Dom, and then we can learn a little bit about who Dom is. And then we've got a great topic, too. We've got a couple topics for him, actually. But before we do that, let's learn about who Dom is.
Yeah, man. Dom, I think I probably met you 2014, maybe somewhere around that time frame.
Yeah.
Right? And so, like...
more in the,
go ahead.
In the heart when you and I were, like, you know, competing, like, frequently. Yeah, that's probably originally how we met each other.
Yeah. And so, you know, up in the Northeast, you know, at least when we were coming up, there weren't a lot of, like, great coaches. But I think Dom established himself very early on as, like, a guy that could help other guys get in really great condition. And that's just a trend that's continued to today where, you know, he's helping guys on the Olympia stage, Arnold Classic stage, the IFBB Pro stage, and all the other levels in between. But, yeah, no, I always admired Dom because the way he could get his ass in shape. Like, I remember I was trying to look for it on your Instagram from a couple years back. I think it was like for the 2018 Nationals prep that we both did, where you're doing like a back flexing video and just like every muscle fiber was particulating and it was just like a nasty ass shot. You guys would appreciate the hell of it. So that just gives you an idea where the name Dom Supersliced comes from, because it's not one of those fake monikers that, you know, people add to their names. Like, he earned it.
Best coach ever, you know.
Yeah.
And I greatly appreciate that, you know, especially coming from you, and kind of how I got into coaching. You know, if you would have asked me 15 years ago, I would have never thought I would be doing this for a living. So I went to school to be a registered dietitian, and when I graduated college, I started doing my internship and then eventually working at a bariatric center in Long Island. It was in Riverhead, Peconic Bay Medical Center. And then at that time, I had transitioned from in high school and then the start of college. I was a pretty high level, like, collegiate wrestler. And I stopped wrestling in college mostly because of some of the horror stories I had in regards to cutting weight. And back then I couldn't believe that, you know, I went to a good wrestling school at the time, that, you know, we were still doing all the old school stuff that guys were doing 20 or 30 years ago, you know, like, you know, not eating for 2 days, going in a sauna with a rubber suit. So that's kind of what inspired me, you know, to switch majors in school. And then I got into bodybuilding. Did my first show that was not it wasn't in the NPC because it was a natural show. And then after that, like, the show pretty much was not very competitive, to say the least. And then I went and watched an NPC show, and I was like, wow, like, why do these guys look so different? And then from there, I made the transition. And then soon I just started seeing, like, there's not too many people that are, really giving people proper guidance in terms of, like even like in terms of just your diet and your training. And then from there, at that time I had like more of a corporate job. I started off helping like maybe 3 people while I still had a full-time job. And then the 3 or 4 of those individuals were very successful. And then it kind of just snowballed into where it is now.
And you, beyond, because I know you coach tons of athletes, very busy with that. You also have several other businesses. You're really getting into more like the preventative medicine side, the health side, that kind of thing. Tell us a little bit about that.
So I don't know if you know, but somewhat recently, over the last like 2 years, I've bounced around. I'm currently in Las Vegas, but I originally moved to North Carolina to open a chain of wellness and anti-aging and preventative medicine clinics there. When I went to North Carolina, I mean, for people that know in like the medical field in the United States, the medical board in each state is totally different. I would compare it almost to like gun laws.
Yeah.
Like you can go to Florida and you could open up one of these clinics and you could be like a phlebotomist. So when I went to North Carolina, I ran into some issues originally, like obtaining a medical license there, over something that was very stupid. But to make a long story short, like if you didn't go to medical school in North Carolina or you weren't born and raised there, they're not too welcoming. Let's just put it that way. So while I was going through this experience, my fiance Amanda, she used to work at a really prestigious clinic here in Las Vegas. So I called her old boss, which is a guy named Dr. John Pierce, and told him a little bit about what I was going through. And he's like, man, I didn't know you guys were going there to open, a clinic. Why didn't you talk to me about it? So he's like, look, I know that you have a full-time job with your coaching business, but he's like, why don't you think about this? Would you guys maybe come back to Las Vegas? I'll give Amanda her full-time job back running the nutrition department. And he told me, he's like, I know you're not a doctor, but he's like, I'm getting rid of a physician assistant. So he's like, I could have you come in, work part-time 2 days a week and kind of fill in that role, meeting with new patients, pretty much assessing their situation, looking at their blood work, ordering labs for them, and then making recommendations. And then I pretty much hand them off to him afterwards. So we ended up coming back, and I did this, and the game plan was after a year, we would sit down and consider opening up a second facility, which that's where we're at now. Still, my coaching business is still like my full-time job, top priority. At the moment, right now, I'm not even physically working in the clinic too much. But now, at this point now, since I was there already working with him for a year and a half, I'm at the point now where I'm going to be going and attempting to, opening up something more so, though, in the telemedicine space, but still in preventative medicine.
Right on.
That's awesome.
Well, listen, Andrew, why don't you take it? But you were saying, before the show, and you mentioned it in our intro, that Dom's guys are always absolutely peeled, So how did you word that question? Because I think it's a really good one.
I think what I said was, I wanted to ask you, is there something you do differently, that you think you do differently than other coaches, that guarantees that when you put your guys on stage, they're going to be, if not the most competitive guy and the conditioned guy in the show, the most conditioned guy you see on stage that year? Because I think that's definitely a standing hallmark of your coaching business is your guys show up in shape. And I was telling, before we started recording, I was like, when I was telling Skip, I'm like, yeah, Dom's one of those guys that when you hear he's got a guy in the show, you're like, crap, like we got someone else that's going to be competing for the most conditioned guy in his class, that kind of thing. So you're like, who's his guy?
I love that too. You can't always control like the genetics. Somebody might not be the biggest guy in the show, but if you can be the absolutely most peeled, I guarantee that everybody in that room is going to respect you.
And I agree so much with that. And that, to me, that compliment means more than anything, because again, you can't do anything if a guy gets on stage and he's got a 27-inch waist and this beautiful structure with these round muscle bellies, but your conditioning is something that you do have control over. So like 2 things I want to say is, 1, a coach is only as good as their athletes are. So you could be the best coach on the planet, hands down, but if you don't have the athletes that are willing to put in the work, your knowledge and your talents are useless, unfortunately. And there are some athletes that can get away. I mean, I've worked with athletes before that also worked with other coaches that I'm not joking. My grandmother could coach them, and they would be peeled, and there's, more than one way to get from point A to point B. But I think, to answer your question, it's more so making sure that they're ahead of schedule, that you're not having to, try to do these magic tricks, the last few weeks, and to make sure that you are, at least 2 or 3 weeks ahead of schedule, especially if you're working for someone for the first time, have them ahead of schedule. So I usually like to do, if they're ready about 3 weeks out, I'll do some form of a mock load with them, where I'll have days where I might do a fat load and then a really, really high saturation day, so I could get an idea of roughly how long is it taking for their body to really store muscle glycogen and, without spilling over, and then, just having them ready, beforehand.
I think that's.
And what would that fat? If you don't mind, just curious what that loading you referred to, a fat load. So immediately, as an example, Scott Abel, because I'm a dinosaur, that name, comes to mind. I'm just wondering if there's any parallels there. And I don't expect you to be, dig into the minutia of it and get real detailed, but
of course,
some idea of what that looks like.
Absolutely. And for anyone for all of you guys that have competed, you can relate to this. So what I mean by the fat loading, the purpose of doing that, if you just go ahead and say you've been dieting for 15 weeks, however, and you were just able to hit, say, 700 grams of carbs, and, say your fats were moderate, a lot of times people will spin through those carbs a lot of times. So what you can do when you do a fat load day, what you're doing is you're loading intracellular triglycerides, essentially, and you're priming the body for a heavy carb load day. So if people want to play around with this, if you had a day, say the show is on a Saturday, and let's say, I don't do this with everyone, this is just an example of how you can utilize fat loading. Say the first day, you have someone, you keep their carbs pretty much similar to what they were on their baseline diet, and you would, jack the fats up high. And for some of them, it could be, over 100, 120. And then the day after the fat load, then you would make that the heaviest carb day, where if the show is on a Saturday, Thursday would be the heaviest carb load day. And I even tell people, your main goal at 2 days out, for me, but again, there's 100 ways you could skin a cat, on that day is to get your glycogen stores loaded. Even if you spill over a little bit, that's okay. You have a whole day to kind of make changes or manipulations, whatever it is that you want to do to dry out, is to get your glycogen stores loaded on that 2 days out. And then on Friday, on that day, I always base that upon the look. I have them send me updates every 3 hours after every meal. And then I could get an assessment then on how their body's responding. If I was to use any sort of a diuretic, which I would say realistically, I probably only use them maybe with 35 or 40% of the people that I have competing. And if I do use them, most of the time it would be a Diazide, and I would microdose it. And another thing that definitely I feel is smart when you do this, and I see a lot of coaches that do this, I see coaches that will go ahead and just tell their client, pop a half or a full Diazide the night before a show.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens.
When it's usually a smarter approach, because people don't realize, but Diazide stays in your system a lot longer than people probably realize that it does. If you start microdosing it, even Thursday night, if you did a fifth of one that night, and then assess their look the next day, and then microdosed it throughout the day as it's needed based upon how they're looking.
Don, would you agree? Would you say 6.25 milligrams is probably a good microdose in a lot of cases?
It's perfect. Yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
I think we probably do things a lot are very similar. And also, I just want to point out for our listeners that the reason for the fat loading is because you do have intracellular fatty acid stores, and you can get fullness from those fats as well. A lot of people sometimes think that it's just about carbohydrates for loading, but you do have intracellular fat stores that you can load with triglycerides. So,
or they know that, but they downplay the impact as it being so insignificant.
Yep.
And that's not necessarily the case.
The
bring up a very good point.
The last 2 days, I mean, your fats and carbs are everything. Like protein really is kind of irrelevant. Like maybe you need a little bit just for nitrogen that can. And this is controversial. I don't need it. Maybe a little bit of protein just for a little bit of nitrogen to keep you peeing. But you could almost make the argument that protein's kind of irrelevant at that point. And especially if you have someone that needs a good amount of food to fill them out to avoid any sort of like GI disruption. And if they do need that much food, then, your bases are your fats and your carbs. And a good kind of test, like an analogy I could give to someone is if they ate a pre-workout meal, let's say someone was eating 100 grams of cream of rice before they went to the gym, with 45 grams of protein. If you did that and went and trained, and then the next day you added, say, 30 grams of almond butter to it, what you'll notice is that the fats will actually slow that glycemic index down to help your glycogen stores stay fuller and stay sustained throughout the workout, opposed to if you didn't have any fats in it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Good point.
Yeah.
It's almost as if the protein can get in the way. It's almost like a hurdle sometimes when it's like really need to fill out, and this protein is slowing this shit down.
Yeah, especially if you're eating meals that are, like if you're eating a meal that's over 120 grams of carbs and 20, 30 grams of fat, then when you have to add in 40 protein in addition to it, that's when you start risking like blowing your midsection out a little bit. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a lot of times you don't really need too much. I still usually leave a little bit in, but I just usually will cut it down significantly like the last 2 or 3 days.
Yeah. It's all situational.
Since we're talking about prep and as you just said, Andrew, it's situational. So there's nothing across the board, but what about sodium? Where does sodium factor in with all of this for you?
Great question. And typically it depends on the person, but I usually do not manipulate that a ton. And what I mean by that is like if they're going into like a depletion phase, if the person even needs to do that, where at like 7 days out or 6 days out, I'll have them run like 3 or 4 really low carb days. I'll have them on those days increase the sodium by at least 25 or 30% from what they were normally taking on those days.
Okay.
And then once they start, like say on that Thursday heavy carb day, on that day, they would either go back to their original sodium intake, what they were having all prep, or I have also done it where I've reduced their normal, like say if they were putting 1/6 of a teaspoon during prep on each meal, on that Thursday, I have pulled it back where I've cut that down by even 25 to 50% with some people. But typically speaking, I'll leave that the same until they start to restrict water. So the night before the show, and I never completely cut out water or like have them stop drinking completely, but I'll usually have them do a set amount of water. Say if it's a Saturday prejudging, that's at, 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning, I'll have them drink a set amount of water by 7 p.m. and then I'll have them control the water where maybe they just do 3 ounces an hour. And then once they pull that water back, I usually will always start to jack up the sodium. And the morning of the show, if you're in a good spot, you should wake up the morning of the show and be dry as the desert, but you should definitely be a little bit flat.
Yeah.
And something I preach on, I tell everyone the last 10 hours before the show, the only thing that's going to be able to possibly fill you out or change your look drastically is sodium and water. So I have even pictures, which I'm sure all of you guys have seen this before. If you have someone wake up the morning of the show, have them just drink 10 ounces of water and watch what 10 ounces of water will do to that person's look in just 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, how many times?
Very short amount of time.
How many times do you have someone, whether it's first thing in the morning or even like the Friday before the show, they do their check-ins, we're all probably the same. We do check-ins 6-7 times on the day, 2 days before the show, day before the show, etc. Where you're like, okay, it's time to eat, but you're like, you know what? Go and drink X amount of water, and then take pictures again for me in 20-25 minutes, and then you make your decision on the meal. Because you're trying to make that decision: are we flat, or do we just need a little bit of water? We don't need more carbs. We just need to add a little bit more water in.
Yeah, no, like nailed it on the head. I do that a lot, and I tell people typically the morning of the show, like even if you're using insulin, carbs take longer than people think to actually convert into like actual muscle glycogen. Mm-hmm. So again, like the only thing that's going to change your look pretty drastically is in a short time frame is the sodium and the water. And sometimes I'll have certain people maybe like right before the stage, I'll have them do a heavy blast of sodium with a small amount of fluids right before they start pumping up, and that usually tops them off perfectly.
Yeah.
You make a good point too, because masters guys, we tend to struggle with distension after years of, we lived through the 90s with force feeding size and that sort of thing. That food volume the morning of the show, for some people, can make or break you, because even if you do get fullness out of it, a little bit of fullness, what you give up in the midsection, there's the ROI is definitely not there. I did have another question too. I wonder, and this isn't me questioning methodology. You do what you do, and you're very good at it. What I'm wondering though is, why not hydrochlorothiazide versus the Diazide? Is there a reason, or is it just because you're familiar with that compound and you've used it, and you stay with what you're familiar with because you know how people respond to it?
So that's a good question. So typically I used to use Diazide with tritramarine in it. The pills, they're 37.5 tritramarine, and I think they're 25 Diazide. And I used to do that more so because they say like it's less potassium sparing. But I will tell you, I don't notice that much of a difference in terms of, this is making someone cramp more than the other diuretic. I had another theory. Again, I'm big on like a lot of clinical data, but so there's no clinical data behind this, but something that I really started thinking about this, and I asked a doctor friend of mine. She's like, that's actually, you make a good point. I used to use the tritramarine and the Diazide capsules, the 37.5 and 25. I used to, and have them microdose that and take it out of the capsule and just suck up the powder. And I started noticing that I felt like the pressed tabs were just pulling better, and they were just working better for some reason. So I'm like, looking at this, I'm like, why is this? And then I was thinking that maybe because if you're taking it out of that capsule, that by the time the body fully absorbs it, that it's not being fully absorbed the same way that the tablet would, since it has the coating around it, where it's supposed to, where your body doesn't just break it down in your GI tract.
Can I give an alternative hypothesis on that?
Yeah.
I feel like, and I might be wrong, but a tablet is probably evenly distributed with the two compounds, whereas the capsule, you don't know for sure exactly if those grains of powder are the tritramarine or the Diazide. You know what I'm saying? Like, so
you're 100% right. I never thought of it like that, but you're right.
Yeah, so that's why my preference is when someone says they got capsules, I go, hold on, I'll send you something in the mail instead. I'd rather use this because I know what this does. I'm very familiar with this one. Because, a lot of times we're limited to what a client has, right? When you might tell them to get this and they get something a little bit different. So you're like, okay, well, we're going to use our brains here and we'll make the best educated guess. But, I mean, a lot of times I end up just like, if someone doesn't have something that I want, I'm like, what's your address? I'll overnight it. We'll make sure you have, what we need. So.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And there can be a big difference between a 25-25 and a 50-25.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, if you're getting a strip of if 80% of what you're drawing up is like tramorine, right, versus the other diuretic, like could that change the pharmacodynamics of the pill or what you're absorbing, and then change the actual what it does to your kidneys? You know, because I always think about stuff like that, like how are we making sure we're getting exactly what we think we're getting, so that we can have good information going forward. You know.
Yeah. And the reason I asked that is just because I found myself with my over the years that the hydrochlorothiazide itself tends to doesn't react quicker, but it gives a quicker response versus the triamtrene, essentially like aldactone. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but it has that same type of impact where I feel like the triamtrene is kind of an extended.
Yeah, the hydrochlorothiazide has a shorter duration of action.
Exactly. Sure. So, and the reason that I bring that up is because you were talking about putting the sodium back in, and if there is, and this is just how my mind works, the triamtrene is lingering and it has a longer effect than the hydrochlorothiazide does, it could potentially, especially if you had like a 50-25 diazide versus a 25 where the dose is higher, then it could make the addition of the sodium less impactful at the last minute, but it could make the day after the show really fucking impressive.
And Skip, you nailed it on the head too. And I tell people this because I do like a mentoring program for a couple of like really well established coaches, and I tell them anytime that you work with especially if it's the first time you're prepping that person, always have them the day after the show send you check-ins the day after. No question. Yeah. Have them hydrate, have them eat, and then the day after the show you could, and I'll tell them like, of course, they're always going to look better, like fuller in their shoulders, their pecs. Yeah. But if they're much fuller and they're still just as dry and detailed in like their glutes, hamstrings, and lower abs, then you know that you probably could have either pushed more food or manipulated things a little bit differently then. Sure. Yeah.
And like I said, I do respect the fact that there's familiarity too with a specific compound. If you use it over and over and over, it's why. Long time ago, early 2000s, you know, I did have some experience with Lasix in it, and it would sometimes work great, and other times it'd be great, and then 20 minutes later it was shit. So I pulled away from that. And, you know, I will have clients sometimes come to me and say, well, I always use this, I know how to use this, it works great. And I just tell it's such a gamble because I don't have that experience. I have shelved that diuretic so many years ago that I literally can't help you with that timing because it's such a crapshoot as to whether it works. And it's the last thing you want to do at the last minute as a trainer is have everything going great and come into that last 12, 24 hours and then take a risk that could potentially be great. And then the downside is it just goes to shit.
100%. And again, that's why typically in most cases, again, like probably only use like a pharmaceutical grade diuretic and maybe 30 to 40% of all the people that I have getting on stage. And I tell people like, if, you are inside out peeled, you shouldn't need it. Again, there are some people that do. The problem is that, and I tell people this all the time, most people, if they have the potential to go in and win a show, they can win that show at 98%. Yeah. But people sometimes will go ahead and chase that extra. Mm-hmm. Think get that little extra 2 or 3%. Well, that little extra 2 or 3% that you're chasing could potentially knock you down to being, 87%. Yeah. If you're going to go ahead and start doing these extremes, start trying to chase something.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I would argue that 95, well, maybe not 95, arbitrary number to make my point, but 97%, whatever, is better if you're able to replicate it than it is trying to nail 100% if it can't be replicated. Yeah. And then, like you say, the downside is you lose, 8%, you lose 10%.
Because you can't be 100% of everything at the same time. You can't be 100% full, exactly. You can't be 100% dry.
And if you happen to pull it off and it is your 100%, good luck replicating that next time. Yeah. I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's about as, even your best condition, we all know this, not only with ourselves, but with our clients. Your best condition, no matter how good it is can still be improved on. You could still be a little fuller. You can still be just a little bit drier. That's just the way.
I don't know, Skip. You've never been in the hotel room with John Meadows, like before he walks out on stage.
And I say that relative. His
negatives are.
John would say
it. But John also thought he had bad genetics, and he also thought he had a hard time getting in shape. True. And I'm like, John, you start your prep the condition most guys walk on stage.
Yeah,
like structural disabilities aside, and the issues with the abs and stuff with the surgeries, but. I've never seen a guy more peeled in front of me. Like, we're talking every fiber, like just firing as soon as he hits a front double,
Oh, yeah.
I still say if you asked him, though, because he'd be like, I could have been a little bit full. And you're like, what? Or I could have been a little drier. How is that even possible? That guy was in better condition in the off season than most guys that step on stage.
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean, absolutely.
Come on. And no, like what you were saying too, Andrew, about about John Meadows. When people refer to the word conditioning, a lot of times I could look at an athlete and tell how that person was training. Like, you could have two individuals that are sub 5% body fat, and one of them just has that hard granite muscle. And I tell people, like, the way that you train, that will definitely gives the muscle a different type of like hardness, and just the detail to the muscle is totally different. You could see it, like, again, with John Meadows, like the definition of granite, and it, it's contributed to the way he trains, and also that he's willing to suffer to get into that level of body fat. And I'll
also add this, and I think you guys will all agree, especially when you're at a show and you've got like 4 or 5 athletes competing. I feel like this at national shows, because I've had people ask me, other clients of mine, like, hey, can I come with you and follow you? And I'm like, yeah, but like, you'll probably learn nothing that is a take home necessarily, because you're juggling 4 or 5 people, and you're making decisions like for this person, and then 5 minutes later you're making decisions for that person. And it's kind of like, you got to go with your first instinct. I think he's flat. We need to do a little more of this. I think he's too dry now, or he's too flat because he's too dry. We need to add the water in. Whatever it might be, whatever that variable might be. And it's like, you can't just give a textbook answer on what to do with someone. It's really, you got to know that person's body from the prep you've done with them, and the mock peaks you've done, and you got to be in that room with them, or seeing those pictures over and over and over again to be able to make those little minute decisions to help them look a little bit better.
It's like Skip and I were talking about that in the last episode, Andrew, when you were away. And one of the analogies I had, it's like if you're driving in the car with a novice driver and they're watching how you drive, you can't always tell them why you change lanes when you do. It's just a matter of, you've been doing it for so long, there's a level of like gut intuition that goes into it. And some of it isn't even things that I think that I'm not processing all of it. I don't have a concrete, well, I'm going to do A because B and C. It's more like just my gut tells me based off of, it's kind of like I heard it one time, was Dave Palumbo commented on the way Chris Aceto preps people, and he said he's like a little old lady who's making a little old Italian lady who's making sauce. And she doesn't have a recipe, but she gets it right every single time, and there's just an intuition that goes into how she makes it,
Yeah. And I would say that's a big, that when you look at all the ingredients to being a really good prep coach, like more than half of it is having the experience and having the eye for it. And some people just have it really good, where, that they can look at someone's physique and be able to tell, is that person's physique is stressed out. And I know, like, Chris is a good example, because I know I've seen many of his like peaks. He's done things that, like, from a scientific standpoint, are like pretty much don't make sense, but and that that most people would be terrified to doing it. But he stays very calm. He's confident in his decisions, and it ends up panning out like really good. And I heard that one of the years Sean Roden, I can't remember if it was like 2015, he wasn't able to get down like regular food. He had an issue with his stomach. So for 3 days, I don't know if you heard the story, Andrew, for 3 days, all he loaded on was donuts and whey protein.
Oh, yeah.
Now, most people would think like, wow, like it's going to be risky, like a recipe for disaster. But he looked he placed second that year and looked unbelievable.
Yeah.
But, like he knew that person's body and knew the right judgment call to make. And, that's what it boils down to.
He also had the we had to try this because otherwise he would have looked worse if I tried to feed him chicken and rice. And
there's that.
So it's like you're like, we got to go for it now, kid. Like, let's do it.
How many times have coaches, or let me try that again. How many times as coaches have we second guessed ourselves, and the first response was the one you knew you should have gone with, but you're just overthinking. You're like, oh, that was not a bad, and it may not be necessarily in a peak, but you end up coming back to trust your gut, trust your experience, and I think that is one of the few things that can't really be taught when you mentor people.
Yeah. Because
it's something that's just learned. It's like you said, it's instinctive, and it's just something. Why did you change lanes? These things can't always be explained.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
that's where the experience comes into play.
I think as long
Scott, I'm gonna use the bathroom really, really quick.
All right.
I'm gonna come guys. I don't want you guys to just get up and be like, where'd you go? I'll be right back.
I was just about to rap with him too, but we'll hang tight. We'll hang
okay,
tight.
I have time. Still,
All right,
too.
all
I'll
right.
be right back.
I was going to say, I think if you live by the rule or the code of, at the very least, I'm not going to make any decisions that's going to put this person's health in danger. After that, everything else is kind of on the table, right? Like, and what I'm saying by that is, well, you're really holding water. We're going to do 25 milligrams of hydrochlorothiazide every meal, and bump you up to 150 today, because I have seen some people do that, and some good pros have ended up in the hospital because of that. But
for far less than that.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I get your point. I completely agree. But it's like, ooh.
And like this conversation we were having about diuretics, Dom's talking about like a sixth of a tab. So like the reality is how much does it really change things, whether you even use it or not at that point, right?
I think it does but I do think I agree 100% with Dom that, and I think
I'm
you're
not
both
saying
on the
it.
same.
I'm not saying it doesn't make a difference, but is it going to make or break the prep? I don't think that it's going to be like, if we don't have it, then we're done. You know what I mean?
In the same
we're
token,
talking about icing on the cake.
But in the same token, when we're talking about you're not throwing a Hail Mary up before bed by saying, take 25 or 50 milligrams of Diazide. You're microdosing it throughout the day, so you have a really good idea of what's going on. You really know what's going on.
Absolutely.
And you can say, okay, we've had enough. If it only takes 18.75 milligrams for you, that's where we'll cut it. We'll see what you look like in the morning. If we need to add a little bit more, we will. If not, we'll do what we got to do. But
if you're a trainer and it's the morning of the show and you see those pictures and you do something like this, thank God. Oh my God. That's a giant flashing neon sign that you just don't know what you're doing.
Well, I'll say this though, because I will fully admit that early on, when you're first starting out, you have a couple days like that where you wake up Saturday morning, you're like, oh, phew, okay, it worked. And then early on, though. But that's the catch.
I was surprised, like every time, like it actually, like this is what we want. You know what I mean?
Like I'm a coach, I'm good.
Like it was Christmas. It was like Christmas. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
For sure.
And that's not to say that every now and then, even when you're experienced, that you're not going to run into problems and go, and then you got to try to keep the client chill. And take on that stress and anxiety yourself to keep them from, thinking, oh crap, what's going on? Well, so there are exceptions. There's always exceptions.
Here's another question for all you guys, because I get accused by the person in the other room that I'm too much of a downer. I'm like, we don't look good enough. We're looking the way we want, but it's not good enough. And she's like, what are you talking about? He looks amazing. How often do you run into that, Dom? Like when you wake up and you look on Saturday morning and, okay, my guys have, prejudging in 3 hours, and you're like, we could do better. Or, but then you're like, oh, we're dead center. We're peeled from all angles when we're under the lights. You know what I'm saying? You know what I'm getting at?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no. And I would say so every year, I look at areas that I can improve in as a coach. And one thing that I've been really focusing on improving is the communication. So I'll give you an example. I had a guy that's been a long-term client of mine that decided he wanted to try to do this show that was only 20 days away, which the transformation he made was amazing. So at this show, I told him I did have this person, at least I wanted him to microdose Diazide. He ended up accidentally, he was taking L-Dactone, wasn't taking any Diazide, which they work completely very different. Now, he told me this the night before, and this guy is usually like super, super on point. And I even wrote it out in bold, like letters. I guess his brain wasn't working. So, the morning of the show at first, when he told me, I went to be like, are you fucking kidding me? This is why you're not filling out. And and then I took a walk, counted to 10, and I thought to myself, like, if he sees this reaction in me, what good is going to come out of this? So where the old Dominic, like even from 3 or 4 years ago, I would have lost it on him and started giving him a whole explanation of how the mechanisms of action of these two things are, and this is why you're looking the way that you're looking. Yeah. But instead, I just told him, I spoke to my fiance and told her, and she's like, do not tell him that. Yep. So I just told him, I said, look, I played it off at the time. And I said, look, it's no big deal. We'll talk about it a little bit after the show. This is, at the end of the day, this is where we're at, and this is what we're dealing with. Yeah. Like, you still look good. Let's make the best of it from there. And to just keep him mentally in the best place. And that was definitely the smartest thing to do. And then after the show, I told him, I said, look, this is a show that we...
The second you get off stage, call me. Call me first.
I did in the nicest way possible, but it ended up going good. He ended up... it was an international show in Taiwan only a couple of weeks ago, and he ended up technically winning the heavyweight class, but he had to win the overall, and he only lost to the super heavyweight. So the outcome was great, but I explained to him the difference of the two diuretics, and I told him, like, look, and if you were doing the right thing, it wouldn't have mattered because the guy was just outsizing you by 30 pounds or so. Yeah. I told him, like, if this was something like the nationals and you miss getting your pro card, we'd be having a different conversation about this right now. But it's okay, and I communicated it with him much better than I would have, and the result of it and how he left off, it was much better. So I think with like coaching too, I tell people this. There's probably more than 50 to 100 effective ways to get someone from point A to point B. I also think with like good coaching, it's a matter of, do you mesh well with that individual? And I've done consultations before with like elite level pros and told them, like, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know if I'm like the best fit for you. That I don't want this, especially from a health standpoint, because I require, depending on how long that person's been competing for, I require that they go for certain different cardiovascular tests, certain specific types of blood work that you wouldn't test in a normal, like, regular blood panel. And to some people, like, that could be a little bit like overwhelming to them, where, they don't care about those variables and they just want something very basic. And I let them know, like, maybe you're better working with someone else, but for the others, you try to make that relationship with them and ideally create the plan too that they can most likely realistically be consistent with. Because that's what it is at the end of the day. Like, you could have 100 effective plans that get someone from point A to point B. Let me learn this. Not everyone could do chicken and rice 6 or 7 times a day. It's all about what can this person realistically adhere to. And that is by far the most important thing to none is, can they be consistent with this and devising it in a way that they can.
When I first started prepping people, the only thing that mattered was results. You could literally shit on clients. You could tell them, and that's not to say I did, but I saw it time and time again. And I always say it this way, and I'm not going to.
You're not going to change it now.
Words. The sea of turds has become so massive in the online training industry. I always refer to it as a giant sea of turds because the people from the outside looking in, I don't know how they figure out who's full of shit and who isn't. You have to be in the industry or have a connection in the industry to actually know that. But nonetheless, my point is it started out simply just as results. Does this guy or woman, did they get results? From there, people had to actually focus on business acumen, relationships, rapport, client retention, all these things that less trainers, I guess, or less than good trainers who weren't getting great results could come in and do those things. So here's the irony. The things that I bitch about sometimes with this industry being this giant sea of turds actually makes the guys who are good at what they do, it has pushed them to build those relationships, build the rapport, better communication, like you were saying. When people get into this, they're just thinking, I have to get results. I have to get them peeled. That's the only thing that matters. They have no idea how nuanced being good in this industry is and then continuing to stay relevant. So you make good points. I was just trying to just bring it back, back around from my dinosaur perspective.
No, and that's definitely 100% true. And like what my kind of mission statement is, and something I'm passionate about, is I have a lot of other coaches that I work with and do the mentoringship with, and I try to teach them and give them the tools that they need to understand the way that the things that we're doing, how they work on like a cellular level, and teaching them different methods. And I tell them, I'm giving you this knowledge for you to take this and put it in your toolbox. And, don't copy what I necessarily do, but I want you to take it and mold it into your own style. And, that we can never, ever stop learning. And every year, even though like as a dietitian, you need to take a certain amount of CEUs. So since I don't work in a hospital, instead of me doing that, I invest $2,000, $2,500, whatever it may be a year into continuing education. And every year I do something different. And that's Scott. That's how I came across Victoria.
Okay.
Her and I became like good friends. This is a while ago now. I'm thinking probably maybe 5 or 6 years ago, because I started working with more like elite level, like women that were like in figure or women's physique. And, I've worked indirectly in the medical field for years, but what we're doing on a non-physiological level to a woman is totally different. And, I understood always the basics of it, but I knew that she was one of very few people that specialized in not just, optimizing someone's hormones, but how these androgenic compounds affect the female endocrine system. And that's how it started. So that was one of the years I was like, look, I'm going to take the next year to learn the in and outs of the female endocrine system and, how these different drugs affect them. And, learned a ton with her, and she's become like a good friend of mine and Amanda's. And, that's why we share all of our information with her. And then every year I did something different. There was another year where I wanted to dive a little bit more deeper into training. And I actually hired someone to take over all of my training for 6 months, where I'm like, I'm going to turn my coaching brain off and take this different type of training ideology and, play around with it and pick little bits and parts up. And some of it was good. And I mix and combine what I feel like works best and put it in your toolbox.
Yeah. I kind of going all the way back to the first question we had, I feel like this really ties in. I mean, if I were to answer our initial question of taking a guy who's been around the block, how do we raise his level? It's to be open-minded, like you're talking about now, which can be hard to do, right? Like we've seen a certain level of results in our lives. Maybe we've won shows, but then to say like I'm going to turn the reins over to Dom now, it's a lot, man. It's a lot. But I think that's what it takes. Or Skip working with Justin Harris. It's a lot, man.
After not working with anybody for what? Forever and ever. Hallelujah. Yeah.
I'm not going to say
and that's how you get good at what you do. And I tell people like, everybody can learn off of each other, and your knowledge base will expand much more when you have say 10 other like-minded individuals have also been doing this, and you share the experiences of what's going on, like, oh, I did this and noticed that this happened, and then you see these similarities, and that's ultimately what's going to get you a better coach. And also, my earlier years too, competing, that taught me a lot, and I've also learned a ton from not competing. If you would have asked me 6 years ago, like, I did a couple of like microdosing experiments since I haven't competed, and I'll tell you, I was blown away by what was able to be possible on, I'm talking about the lowest amounts of PEDs that you would ever be able to imagine. And if you would have asked me that 7 years ago, I would have said that there's no way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think too, 7 years ago, in your defense, we were indoctrinated to believe it had to be 700 primo or don't even touch it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think there's part of that too. Listen, man, let's let you go. I know you've got a lot going on, and you just were flying today too. So we appreciate you being able to take the time and hang with us. And I'm really grateful to have had the chance to get to meet you here, man. And
you too.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
When we talk about having that opportunity to learn from one another, you got me thinking during the peak conversation. So I'm excited, man. I love talking that stuff. It makes me forget that I'm doing a podcast by the time we got to that section. So I really appreciate it much. And if people wanted to follow you, I'm going to put your Instagram in the description. But where else can people go if they want to, say, reach out to you for coaching or anything else?
So, like, my Instagram handle, everyone knows that. It's Dom Supersliced. I have a website too, which is bestbuiltfitness.com. But usually when people want to reach out to me, I have a administration email where I have an assistant and a billing manager that work for me, and it's bestbuiltclients@yahoo.com. They'll send, if they're interested in whatever services may be, which I do a lot, like only probably about 70% of my clientele is competitors. The other, like, say 35% or so are more like functional or preventative health coaching clients, from like fertility stuff, GI stuff, anything that, I've been doing over the years.
All right. Right on, man. Well, we appreciate you taking the time. And guys, of course, go to teamskip.com if you want to reach out to Skip for coaching, and Body Barry if you want to reach out to Andrew. You can hit me up at McNallyDiets@gmail.com. And, of course, check out TrueNutrition.com. Use our code THINK over there. SupplementSource.ca for Canadians. And thank you to everybody from Patreon, guys, for another episode of Blood, Sweat, and Gear. We will see you soon. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks so much, guys.